It was a humid Saturday afternoon in August of 2012. 55-year-old Thomas Rybinski stood at the helm of his boat, steering it across the lake near his home in Tennessee. He'd spent all day on the water with his wife Colette and a few friends, and it had been the perfect day for boating. Hot and steamy, but with a light breeze sweeping across the lake. Thomas couldn't believe that he'd almost canceled on his wife and friends that morning. He'd woken up with a headache and an upset stomach, but Colette had made him some coffee, which had helped him feel better, and once he was up and moving, Thomas felt okay, still a bit shaky, but good enough to keep their boating date with their friends. Thomas was actually accustomed to having to push through discomfort. He had chronic back pain from an old accident that flared up every time he rode his motorcycle, went on a strenuous hike, or really did any sort of strenuous activity at all. But Thomas loved exercising and being outdoors, and so he wasn't about to stop doing those things just because of a little backache. And he also got cortisone injections every month, which helped manage the pain in his back. Thomas was feeling especially grateful to be boating as he looked out over the bow, navigating the boat around a corner toward a little cove. Once he was in the cove, he dropped the anchor, and Colette started unpacking the food they'd brought for dinner. A few hours later, Thomas was halfway through a lively story about his recent hiking trip to Colorado when he felt a tap on his arm. It was Colette, and he knew she was giving him the signal that it was about time to head back. Thomas looked up and realized the sun was starting to set. He'd been having such a nice time, he really hadn't noticed how late it was getting, and he knew they wanted to be tied up at the dock by nightfall. So Thomas helped his wife pack up quickly, then he pulled up the anchor line and steered the boat back to shore. About a week later, on the following Friday morning, Thomas sat at his desk at General Motors, looking over a blueprint. For years, Thomas had worked as an automotive designer, and right now, he was designing a new vehicle interior. He doodled ideas on a spare sheet of paper as he brainstormed. But today, he was just drawing a blank. In fact, the only thing he could even think about was the pounding going on in his head. Last weekend's headache that almost made him cancel that boating outing had come back. And it actually had gotten worse and worse throughout this last week. Now the pain was sharp and persistent, like somebody was snapping a rubber band against his temples over and over again. Thomas put his elbows on his desk and cradled his face, trying to block out the stark overhead lighting in his office. Thomas hated the idea of leaving work early, but for the first time in years, he was debating whether or not he should go home sick. But ultimately, after rubbing his eyes and thinking about it for a second, he decided he would just try to tough it out. If he was going to have a headache, he figured he'd rather have it here, where at least he could attempt to kind of occupy his mind for a moment by working on a project that he loved. But once the clock in his office finally reached 5 p.m., Thomas was so ready to get out of there. He packed up and headed home for the weekend, glad to have the next 2 days to rest up and recharge. But that weekend, his headache didn't go away. And on Sunday morning, Thomas awoke to some of the worst pain he'd ever felt in his life. He turned over in bed and told Colette that it felt like the inside of his head was about to explode. Colette looked totally shocked, and Thomas knew why. He never complained about pain. So for him to say something like this meant it must be really serious. And so Thomas didn't even argue when Colette told him they had to go see a doctor. About an hour later, at the Vanderbilt University Medical Center, a doctor named Annie Wilkins walked into an exam room. Thomas was her first patient of the day. He was sitting on the exam table, clutching his head with his hands, while Colette rubbed his back. And so from the moment Dr. Wilkins saw Thomas, she could tell he was in immense pain. Dr. Wilkins asked Thomas to lift his head up for a moment so she could give him a routine examination. But as Dr. Wilkins moved her finger around in front of Thomas's face, she noticed that his eyes were struggling to follow it. In fact, it didn't seem like Thomas could focus on anything at all. That lack of focus, coupled with this extreme headache he was describing, made Dr. Wilkins suspect that Thomas had an infection in his brain, a condition called meningitis. She wondered if he had been exposed to something out of the ordinary that could cause meningitis, and so she asked him if he'd traveled anywhere new recently. Thomas nodded and said actually he'd just gotten back from a hiking trip in Colorado, and that was a red flag to Dr. Wilkins. Anytime a patient mentioned hiking, she knew that tick bites could be a factor. Ticks can be infected with bacteria and viruses and can spread diseases through their bites. Dr. Wilkins wondered if maybe Thomas had been bitten by a tick in Colorado and developed something called Rocky Mountain spotted fever, whose symptoms include meningitis. To find out, Dr. Wilkins told Thomas that he would need to undergo a spinal tap so the lab could study his spinal fluid for signs of disease. First, she wanted to know whether or not he had meningitis, and then also whether or not Rocky Mountain spotted fever caused the meningitis. Thomas grimaced at the thought of a needle going into his spine, but the doctor told him really it was no big deal and they would have answers soon. About 90 minutes later, Dr. Wilkins received the first results from the spinal tap. Thomas did indeed have meningitis. So Dr. Wilkins asked a nurse to start Thomas on antibiotics right away, which would help reduce the swelling around Thomas's brain and his spinal cord. But about an hour later, Dr. Wilkins got a surprise when the rest of Thomas's lab results came back. Thomas's spinal fluid showed that he did not have Rocky Mountain spotted fever. In fact, there was no trace of any bacteria or virus in his spinal fluid at all, which left Dr. Wilkins feeling totally perplexed. She had been fairly confident that Thomas would test positive for Rocky Mountain spotted fever, and if not that, then definitely some other virus or bacteria. After all, viruses and bacteria cause the vast majority of meningitis cases. Dr. Wilkins knew that other invaders can also cause the disease, such as parasites, but that usually only happened to people who traveled internationally. And in extremely rare cases, patients could get meningitis from a fungus that lives on unsterilized surgical equipment, but Thomas hadn't had any surgeries. So Dr. Wilkins was at a total loss as she walked back towards Thomas's room. She found him inside, lying awake in bed, with his wife Colette sitting nearby in a chair. Dr. Wilkins was relieved to see Thomas looking much more alert than when he'd come into the hospital a few hours ago. The antibiotics already seemed to be helping him. Colette stood to greet Dr. Wilkins and then quickly asked her if they knew what was wrong with her husband. But Dr. Wilkins had to be honest and said no, she didn't know yet. She was going to keep Thomas in the hospital for a few days. That way they could keep an eye on him as the antibiotics fought the infection. But she still did not know what had caused this infection in the first place. Over the next few days, Thomas steadily recovered, and on the 5th morning of his hospital stay, Dr. Wilkins was glad to see that Thomas was nearly back to his usual self. He wasn't in pain, and he no longer seemed groggy. Dr. Wilkins felt so confident about Thomas's condition that she actually discharged him from the hospital so he could finish recovering at home. 1 week later, on September 7th, an epidemiologist named Dr. April Petit returned to work at Vanderbilt University Medical Center after a week off. She began her day by looking over her patients' charts, and one caught her eye. Thomas Rybinski was back at the hospital and had just been transferred by Dr. Wilkins to Dr. Petit's care. Dr. Petit looked closer at his chart, and she saw that Thomas had been given a 2-week treatment of antibiotics to take it home, but after only a few days of that, he'd felt so sick that he had to come back to the hospital. Dr. Petit made her way to Thomas's room, and when she went inside, she saw Thomas laying in bed with a dazed look on his face. His wife Colette was sitting by his side, and she explained that Thomas had been acting confused all morning, and also, for the past few days, he'd been complaining of lower back pain. Dr. Petit nodded and then walked over to Thomas's bedside and gently asked him how he was feeling. And Thomas looked up at her, but he had this look on his face like he didn't understand the question, and then he just stayed silent. Dr. Petit frowned, knowing her job just got much more difficult because clearly Thomas was not going to be able to tell her exactly how he was feeling. All she'd have to go on was Thomas's medical records and anything Colette could tell her. Dr. Petit suspected that Thomas's meningitis must have flared up again. So she ordered an MRI of Thomas's spine and brain, as well as another spinal tap. She also started Thomas on a new cocktail of antibiotics, and she asked the lab to test his spinal cord fluid again to try to find the cause of this infection. Later that evening, Dr. Petit stopped by Thomas's room to check on him, and she was pleasantly surprised to see that he already seemed to be improving. But as she headed home that night, she couldn't help but still feel nervous for Thomas. After all, they thought he was getting better once before, and now he was back in the hospital, sicker than ever. Six days later, on September 13th, Dr. Petit arrived for an early morning shift, feeling sleepy as she drank the last sips of the coffee she'd gotten on the way to work. The moment she sat down in her office, her pager went off, calling her to Thomas Rybinski's room. Dr. Petit had a bad feeling. Even though Thomas had improved slightly in his first afternoon back in the hospital, he was incoherent again by the next morning, just as Dr. Petit had feared. And he'd only been getting worse as the week wore on. When she arrived in his room and said hello to Thomas, she immediately noticed that the right side of his face was completely slack. His features were drooping, and Dr. Petit suspected that Thomas had suffered a stroke. And so she pressed the call button because Thomas would need a brain scan right now. An hour later, Dr. Petit received the brain scan results, which showed that the arteries at the back of Thomas's head were blocked. They also showed a pool of blood where Thomas's brain and spinal column met. Dr. Petit shook her head. Thomas definitely suffered a stroke. She knew that this damage was caused by something that was trying to invade Thomas's brain. But what was it? Thomas's spinal fluid was still free of bacteria and viruses. It made no sense. And yet there had to be some logical answer. Dr. Petit just needed to find it. The next morning, when Dr. Petit arrived at the hospital, she found a shocking lab result waiting for her. At last, she knew what was causing Thomas's meningitis. But the answer was truly bizarre. The infection came from a fungus that normally would not cause disease in healthy patients like Thomas, and so it seemed impossible. But the lab results were undeniable. A shiver ran down Dr. Petit's spine. Fungal meningitis is not only rare, but it's also deadly. Many patients die from it, even with proper treatment, and so Dr. Petit raced down the hall to order new medication for Thomas, hoping they were not too late. 5 days later, on September 18th, Dr. Petit sat in her office, combing through medical journals. She was still stunned over Thomas's diagnosis and was trying to find a published study that might help her understand how Thomas's brain had been invaded by fungus. But it was not until late afternoon that she finally landed on an article that piqued her interest. The article was about a cluster of fungal meningitis outbreaks that occurred following a devastating 2004 tsunami in the Indian Ocean. Following the tsunami, pregnant women began developing fungal meningitis after getting epidural shots in their spines with needles that had been stored in damp warehouses. The dampness turned out to be a breeding ground for fungus, which made these needles deadly. Dr. Petit wondered if something similar could have happened to Thomas, that he'd been injected with a fungus-covered needle. If that was the case, then other people might have gotten the same dangerous treatment. She began drafting an email to the Tennessee Department of Health. She needed to report Thomas's case right away. But as she typed, her pager went off. It was another alert about Thomas, and this time he was crashing. So Dr. Petit got up and raced out of her office and down the hall to Thomas's room, and when she went in there, she saw Colette in the corner crying, and a nurse who was right by Thomas's bedside preparing to intubate Thomas because Thomas had stopped breathing. That same afternoon, so on September 18th, Dr. Marion Kaner was answering emails from her desk at the Tennessee Department of Health, where she specialized in tracking infectious diseases. Dr. Kaner yawned and lifted her rimless glasses to rub her eyes. She was normally peppy and focused, but always seemed to get a bit tired when it was time to sign off for the day. But then an email labeled urgent popped into her inbox. The email was about Thomas Rybinski's rare case of fungal meningitis and his doctor's suspicion that it could have been caused by dirty needles. Dr. Petit had managed to stabilize Thomas, but he was in critical condition, and Dr. Petit was worried that others might get sick too. Initially, Dr. Kaner thought that Dr. Petit's worry about some kind of a fungal meningitis outbreak seemed far-fetched. That is, until she read a very interesting detail in Dr. Petit's letter. About 2 weeks before Thomas got sick, he had gone to a nearby clinic for a steroid injection to help with his chronic back pain. So it was at least possible that that clinic injected him with a dirty needle. Dr. Kaner was familiar with the clinic in question. She knew they saw about 160 patients each week, which meant that if one patient had been infected by a dirty needle, there were likely to be more cases. Dr. Kaner decided to launch an immediate investigation. Two days later, Dr. Kaner parked her car at the St. Thomas Pain Clinic, which was where Thomas had received his steroid injection. Earlier that morning, Dr. Kaner had received word that 2 additional patients had shown up at Tennessee hospitals with fungal meningitis, and both of them had also been treated at this St. Thomas Pain Clinic. Dr. Kaner called the clinic to inform them of the infections, as well as her suspicions that the pain clinic could be at fault. To her relief, the clinic director immediately volunteered to shut down until they could determine what was causing the meningitis. Dr. Kaner and a few colleagues got out of the car and walked inside the modern-looking clinic with big glass doors and tall windows. The clinic director came out into the waiting room to greet them. Dr. Kaner shook his hand and explained they would need to swab the entire clinic for signs of contamination. And the director said that was totally fine, take your time, and just said if you need anything from me, let me know. Dr. Kaner and her team followed the clinic director through the facility, which Dr. Kaner noticed was sparkling clean. The director showed her where supplies were kept, including syringes and needles. Then he walked them over to the industrial fridges where they kept the steroids and other medicines. The investigators took samples and got busy making sure everything was up to code. Meanwhile, Dr. Kaner kept an eye out for mold. She even got down on her hands and knees to inspect the refrigerators, but she found nothing. Dr. Kaner would still test the samples they'd collected, but she had to admit, the clinic appeared clean and safe. There were no expired steroids, no dirty instruments. It was clear the medical staff took great care of the place and followed protocol to a T. But for the purposes of Dr. Kaner's investigation, this actually was a big problem. Because if this clinic wasn't to blame for the 3 cases of fungal meningitis amongst the clinic patients, then something much bigger must be going on. Dr. Kaner thanked the clinic director before heading back to her office, knowing it was time to alert the Centers for Disease Control, or CDC, the agency that handles national disease outbreaks. A few days later, Dr. Kaner sat in a conference call with researchers from the CDC who were calling from their headquarters in Atlanta, Georgia. After first contacting the CDC, Dr. Kaner had reached out to medical professionals all across the state. So far, she had received word of 1 confirmed death and 5 cases of suspected fungal meningitis. All of the cases were linked somehow to the St. Thomas Pain Clinic, but investigators couldn't find any source of contamination there. CDC investigators raised the possibility that the clinic could have received supplies that were already contaminated when they arrived, so they had started to carefully track these suppliers for every single item used at that clinic. They were checking not just the needles, but also the syringes, anesthetics, surgical dye, even the trays used to hold the instruments. But despite several days of work, they still had not found the source of infection yet. As Dr. Kaner listened in on this conference call, one of the investigators in Atlanta reminded everybody on the call that many of the patients at the St. Thomas Pain Clinic had received steroid injections to relieve their discomfort. So, if the clinic's needles weren't dirty, then maybe the problem was actually the steroids themselves. Another CDC official then added that it would be easy enough to check because all of the clinic's steroids had all come from the same place, the New England Compounding Center, or NECC for short, which was located in Framingham, Massachusetts. The CDC investigators said they should let NECC know which steroid batches were being linked to the meningitis cases. That way the company could recall the batches immediately. And so Dr. Kaner suddenly felt hopeful. She left the conference call feeling certain that NECC would recall the drugs and this meningitis scare would soon be over. At 6 a.m. on October 2nd, so a couple of weeks after Dr. Kaner began her investigation, a U.S. Food and Drug Administration investigator named Stacy DeGarmo pulled into the NECC's parking lot. One of her colleagues sat in the passenger seat taking photographs. Thomas Rybinski, whose case started the investigation, had now passed away from his fungal meningitis. So now, at least 2 people in Tennessee had died after receiving this steroid injection compounded at the NECC, and there were 14 other cases identified across the nation. But it had the potential to get much, much worse because NECC shipped so many steroids all over the country. Dr. Kaner and the CDC investigators had learned that the NECC had distributed 17,675 vials of potentially contaminated steroids across 23 different states. The Food and Drug Administration, or FDA, had quickly gotten involved and almost immediately decided they needed to pay NECC a physical visit. Lead FDA investigator, DeGarmo, was certain she would find the answers they needed inside the sort of bland-looking brown brick building where the NECC was headquartered. As DeGarmo looked across the parking lot, she immediately saw something troubling. There was a huge construction vehicle, like an excavator, with a big mechanical shovel that was tearing in to a pile of construction debris and other trash, spreading dust all around. A mess like that has no business being outside of a building where drugs are made. DeGarmo shook her head and climbed out of her car. She'd never been to NECC, but she was not surprised when she'd gotten a call about them from the CDC. Her agency had a history of run-ins with NECC, including a time 10 years earlier when their steroids had given a few patients meningitis-like symptoms. So if these executives at NECC were up to no good, well, DeGarmo was thrilled to be the one to ruin their day. DeGarmo and her colleague walked into the ground floor laboratory of the NECC, where two company executives stood waiting for them. They didn't look particularly pleased to be up so early, especially to be giving a tour to two FDA investigators. Still, DeGarmo followed after one executive, while her colleague went with the other. The executive that DeGarmo had followed led her through the laboratory, and DeGarmo noticed right away that the facility was absolutely filthy. As DeGarmo looked over documents, her colleague zipped on a gown, put a respirator on her face, and entered the facility's clean room, where most of the facility's lab work took place. DeGarmo remained outside because she was pregnant, but she watched through a window as her colleague moved methodically around the room, wiping surfaces with a sponge. When she finished with each sponge, she dropped it into a sterile bag so that the sponge and whatever was on it could be tested later. From the door, DeGarmo could see that one of the ovens used to sterilize the NECC drugs was obviously covered in this sort of brown muck. She watched with disgust as her colleague carefully swiped the oven and then dropped that dirty sponge into a bag. 12 hours later, DeGarmo and her colleague were exhausted, but they still were not done combing through the NECC lab. They needed several more days to finish their investigation as NECC lawyers raised one objection after another. Finally, on the third day of the FDA investigation into the NECC facility, NECC executives just straight up would not let DeGarmo back into the building. So the following week, on October 16th, Massachusetts health agents raided NECC, and they would make a staggering discovery. Not one, but 3 batches of steroids made at NECC were found to be contaminated, meaning that tens of thousands of infected vials had been sent out across the country, including to the St. Thomas Pain Clinic in Tennessee. Overall, NECC was a sanitary nightmare. Not only was the lab dirty, but the owners of the manufacturing center also owned a waste management business that was right next door. And investigators found that NECC's whole operation was pretty much illegal. They were mass-producing drugs that they had no legal right to make. And when investigators looked even more closely, they found the NECC had actually created thousands of imaginary patients just to make it seem like their operation was legitimate. All told, more than 100 people died from NECC's contaminated steroids, and almost 800 other people got sick in what was the worst pharmaceutical disaster in decades. NECC's supervising pharmacist, whose name was Glenn Chin, along with several other executives, were sent to jail over their role in creating the dangerous conditions in their facility. Prosecutors said they had all chosen profits over keeping patients safe. On the morning of December 18, 2020, 50-year-old Brooke Stroud wandered into her spacious kitchen in Washington, D.C., where she lived with her husband, Stefan, and their 3 young adult children. Brooke shook her head and tried to concentrate as she searched for the cup of coffee she'd brewed earlier. She hadn't been herself the last few days. Her head felt foggy, and little things, like where she'd put her coffee, had been slipping her mind. Brooke spotted the cup in a corner right near their large Viking stove. She grabbed it and headed out of the kitchen and into the formal living room. She slipped on a jacket and went out to the backyard, making a beeline for the separate guest house where she'd set up a home office. It was 9 months into the COVID-19 pandemic, and most businesses all over the country were shut down. Brooke was a clinical psychologist, and she had switched all her in-person sessions to Zoom. This morning, she had a group call, so she set her mug down at her wooden desk, turned on her laptop, and logged into her meeting. As Brooke said hello to the other participants, a wave of exhaustion suddenly washed over her. Her head felt heavy, and every bone in her body was suddenly aching. A scary thought crossed Brooke's mind. Maybe she'd finally gotten COVID, a disease that had already killed 350,000 people in the United States alone. She tried to power through the meeting, but all she could think about was how awful she felt. And so after only a few minutes of being in this meeting, she told everybody on the call that she just wasn't feeling well and asked if they could actually reschedule. After logging out of the Zoom call, Brooke took a minute to collect herself. She didn't think her symptoms seemed like COVID, so she wondered if maybe she was just overdoing it and was maybe tired from the stress of her job. She loved her work, but her hours have been crazy since the pandemic started. More people than ever were turning to therapy to get through these very difficult times. So she decided to cancel the rest of her sessions for the day and just go get some rest. She took the familiar path out of the guest house, through the backyard, and into the main house, walking more slowly than usual. Brooke climbed the winding staircase up to the second floor and into the master bedroom. There she climbed into bed, hoping to sleep off her weariness. Hours later, around noon, Brooke blinked her eyes open. Groggily, she sat up and felt around the bed. Her crisp white sheets were now totally damp with sweat. Brooke touched her forehead and realized she was burning up. She stumbled out of her bed and into the bathroom to take her temperature, and she saw it was 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and so she knew she was officially sick. Brooke tried to figure out what to do. She needed to get herself tested for COVID as soon as possible, but at-home COVID tests were not available at this time, which meant she'd have to set up an appointment with her doctor. Until she had the results, she could stay in her bedroom to avoid infecting her family potentially, but then she realized it was likely too late to actually isolate herself. Her youngest kids, 19-year-old Alex and 17-year-old Olivia, had come home from college and boarding school for the holidays a few days earlier, and they were probably already exposed to whatever Brooke had. So she decided it likely made the most sense to just kind of go about her day as usual, but at the same time, try to keep her distance from the kids and her husband. So Brooke put her hair up in a messy bun and headed downstairs. A few hours later, Brooke gathered everyone for dinner. She sat at one end of their long table, while Stefan and the kids were at the other. Brooke wasn't up to cooking, so she ordered takeout from an Italian place, and the table was overflowing with pastas and salads. Alex and Olivia piled their plates high. They always had big appetites when they came home after months of school cafeteria food. Brooke was glad to see her kids eating, but for her, her fever was still burning, and she felt barely hungry at all. She pushed her pasta around her plate as her kids talked about what their semesters had been like with all the COVID protocols. Alex went to college in North Carolina, and Olivia was a high school senior at the same all-girls boarding school in Virginia that Brooke had actually attended. Brooke's oldest child, Sebastian, went to college in Vermont and wouldn't be home for a few days. Brooke really hoped she'd feel better by then, so they could all spend the holidays together, stress-free. Alex looked excited as he told them all about school, but Brooke could see the sadness in Olivia's eyes as she talked about the way COVID restrictions had basically ruined campus life. Normally, she played on a few different sports teams, but the pandemic had put all of them on hold. Brooke felt sorry for Olivia. Even though the pandemic was hurting everybody, she knew her daughter was having an especially hard time. She had looked forward to being a senior for so long, and now that she was, everything seemed to be falling apart. But Brooke's job was to be Olivia's mom, not her therapist, and they were all trying to figure out how to adjust to this new normal. After everyone was done eating, Brooke suggested they watch an old Christmas movie. Brooke took a seat at the opposite end of the couch from Stefan and the kids, and then willed herself to stay awake. Even after napping for several hours that day, she was still exhausted. About halfway through the movie, Brooke noticed her husband massaging his temples, and he also had a strained look on his face. She asked him what was wrong, and he explained his head was pounding. Brooke suggested he go check his temperature. Maybe he had a fever too. They paused the TV, and Stefan headed upstairs, holding onto the banister for support. A few minutes later, Brooke heard him vomiting. So she mustered what little strength she had left and ran up to find him leaning over the toilet bowl. She rubbed Stefan's back, trying to soothe him, but then she heard Alex and Olivia yell for her. Brooke told her husband she'd be right back, and she retraced her footsteps back to the living room. There, she found Alex and Olivia lying on the couch, clutching their heads in their hands as well. They complained that they also had terrible headaches. Brooke turned to go get them some water from the kitchen, while Alex shot up from the couch and ran to the guest bathroom. A second later, Brooke heard him retching too. And as if on cue, Olivia started dry heaving as well. Brooke ran to the kitchen at this point and grabbed a trash can, and she made it back to the living room just in time to set the bin in front of her daughter as she threw up all of her dinner. The following afternoon, Brooke and Stefan sat next to each other inside of a small exam room at their family doctor's office. Brooke had woken up that morning feeling like she'd barely gotten any sleep, even though she'd slept through the entire night, and the rest of her family felt just as bad, so Brooke had decided to get herself and Stefan checked for COVID. Brooke pulled her mask down under her nose, leaving just enough room for the nurse to insert a long nasal swab into her left nostril. It went so far back that it felt like Brooke's brain was being tickled. Her eyes teared up at the sensation, and she stifled a sneeze. The nurse rotated the swab around her nose for several seconds until it was coated with fluid, and then she repeated the same thing in Brooke's right nostril. And then she did the whole process all over again for Stefan. The nurse explained it would take about 24 hours for them to receive the test results by email. Then she took the swabs and left the room, while Brooke and Stefan checked out at the front desk. The next day, December 20th, 2020, Brooke stared at an email she had gotten from her doctor on her phone. She and Stefan were both negative for COVID, which was great, but they still felt horrible, and so clearly they were sick with something. Brooke decided to call Alex and Olivia's pediatrician to see if the kids should get tested for COVID too. But their doctor explained that it probably didn't make sense since Brooke and Stefan already tested negative. Whatever germs they had would have already infected the kids, but very, very likely it was not COVID. So the doctor recommended that everybody in the family just stay home, get some rest, drink lots of fluids, and surely this whole thing will just pass. However, a few days later, Brooke woke up aching all over still. Her fever had stayed steady at 100 degrees Fahrenheit, clouding her mind. The rest of her family felt just as bad too. Their headaches had never really gone away, and some mornings they still woke up feeling very nauseous. But Brooke fought through the fatigue and dragged herself out to her office in the guest house. She knew she was supposed to focus on resting and powering up her immune system, but she felt a responsibility to her clients. Her family was not the only one struggling right now during this weird holiday season. So Brooke settled in at her desk and logged into her first Zoom call. And as she took notes and chatted with other clients throughout the day, she felt herself perk up a bit. Slowly, her headache subsided, and the exhaustion that had usually overpowered her these last few days began to lift. Brooke thought about how good it felt to focus on other people for a change. Around 5 p.m., she wrapped up her sessions and made her way back to the house. She felt optimistic for the first time in a while that maybe she was finally getting over this illness. And so, Brooke, feeling really good, decided she would surprise the family by cooking a nice dinner. An hour later, Brooke called her whole family over to the dining room. She'd grilled some nice, thick steaks, figuring they could all use the protein. Brooke smiled as she doled out plates of food, silently telling herself that they would all be better by Christmas. She'd gotten sick before everybody else, so it made sense that she was recovering sooner too. But as Brooke took a bite of this food she made, she suddenly felt all that heaviness in her head and body start to creep back in. She told herself it was nothing, ignoring the queasiness that was growing in her stomach, and she managed to swallow a few bites of food before she just gave up. And she could see that the rest of her family also could not stomach their food either. Brooke watched Olivia push her salad around listlessly. She was usually so bubbly and full of life, but tonight, just like the rest of them, she looked defeated. Brooke sighed and began clearing their plates covered with uneaten food. After cleaning up, it took all the strength she had left just to shuffle upstairs and fall into her bed. The next afternoon, December 23rd, Brooke heard the front door open. She'd spent all morning in bed, but now she gathered the energy to limp down the stairs to the foyer, her muscles weak from this mystery illness and lack of physical activity. Her hair was matted, and she was wearing the same sweatpants and sweatshirt she'd been in for the past few days. But she managed a weak smile at the sight of her son, Sebastian, standing there with his duffel bag slung over his shoulder, finally home from his college in Vermont. He looked fit and healthy, the rosiness in his cheeks a stark contrast to the paleness of her own face. She'd warned Sebastian that his family was not feeling well, But he joked that, nobody was feeling well these days. After all, it's the pandemic. And he said he would rather get sick at home than spend the holidays somewhere else without his family. Brooke stood at the bottom step, trying to keep her distance from her son, even as she told him how happy she was that he was home. But Sebastian just laughed and pulled her into a big bear hug. Brooke allowed him to wrap his arms around her, a sense of relief washing over her. A few hours later, the whole family sat in the living room eating cheese and crackers, while Sebastian told them all about his fall semester at college. As he described the off-campus house where he lived, Brooke saw Sebastian slowly sink into the couch, and his voice started to sound fatigued. She asked him if he felt okay, and Sebastian said he was just tired from finishing up his last paper for school and then catching a flight home. Brooke smiled and suggested he go to his room and get some rest. But inside, Brooke started worrying that Sebastian might be coming down with this same mystery illness that was dogging the rest of them. A couple of days after Christmas, Brooke's daughter Olivia woke up with a throbbing headache just as she had every morning since coming home. Her muscles still ached and she still didn't feel rested at all. In fact, it felt like she could sleep for another 5 hours, and even that probably wouldn't be enough. Olivia looked around her room, noticing all the tissues and dirty clothes she had scattered on the carpet. Usually she kept her space very nice and tidy, but she didn't have the energy or motivation to clean or do much of anything, really. So far, her winter break had been a total disaster. Olivia had expected the holidays to be different because of the COVID pandemic, but she'd hoped to have at least some fun. Now, the only silver lining was her upcoming trip to visit Caroline, her best friend from school who lived in New Orleans. Then, the plan was for them to fly back to DC together and spend 2 more weeks in isolation at Olivia's house. Their boarding school wanted all students to quarantine before returning for the spring semester, so they were going to do that together in DC. But Olivia was now worried that the family's mystery illness could ruin her visit to Caroline's house too. So Olivia asked her parents to please set up an appointment with her pediatrician that afternoon. If doctors could just figure out what was making her sick, maybe Olivia could get the right treatment in time to go visit her friend. The next day, Olivia sat down next to her very ragged-looking mom at the kitchen table. Brooke blew on the steaming cup of tea in front of her, cooling it down before taking a long sip. She had purple bags under her eyes and her hair was a total mess. Olivia obviously knew her mom was not feeling great, none of them were, but she needed her mom's attention right now. She gathered up her willpower, pushing away the nausea and exhaustion she felt, and reminded herself of the argument she'd practiced. She was determined to see her friend Caroline and get back to living her life. First, Olivia gave her mom a rundown of her visit to the pediatrician the previous day. Dr. Stein had given her a COVID test just to be safe. She also checked for parvovirus, which causes mild respiratory illness, and Epstein-Barr virus, a common illness that would be making Olivia very drowsy. Olivia explained to her mom that all the results had come back negative. Then, before Brooke could even respond, Olivia launched into the speech she'd prepared. She told her mother, since she didn't have any of those viruses or COVID, she should be able to go see Caroline. All she was doing here was sitting at the house and watching TV, and after saying this, Olivia just went quiet and watched her mom consider her words. She could see the wheels in her mother's mind turning, and for a moment, it seemed like her mom might actually agree with her. But before Olivia could celebrate her victory, her mom's face got serious, and she began to speak in a very soft voice. Brooke explained that she, Olivia, her daughter, was already sick, and she couldn't risk traveling and getting worse, even if she didn't know what the sickness was. Olivia immediately huffed in frustration and thought about arguing more with her mom, but as upsetting as this was, she knew her mom was right. She did feel terrible, and clearly whatever she had likely was contagious because her whole family had it. So Olivia turned and headed up the stairs to her bedroom, her breathing ragged and her spirits deflated. Brooke sighed as she heard Olivia kind of stomping around upstairs, obviously still very upset, and Brooke couldn't help but feel sorry for her teenage daughter. This holiday season wasn't what any of them were expecting, but it seemed like Olivia was really taking it the hardest. She thrived on interacting with people, and she had already been through a semester at school full of remote classes and social distancing because of COVID. This trip to New Orleans was supposed to be her big chance to go have some fun and explore a new city with a very close friend. Brooke wondered if there was anything she could do to salvage the rest of Olivia's break. She stood up from the couch, fighting off the dizziness that came whenever she moved too quickly, and just then a thought crossed her mind. Brooke grabbed her phone off the coffee table and made her way outside to the backyard and began looking through her contacts until she found the name John Schifflian, who was Caroline's dad. Brooke paced around the garden as she spoke to John, savoring the fresh air, and she explained to him what had been going on at her house and that unfortunately, Olivia was too sick to travel to New Orleans to see Caroline. Brooke was very clear that her whole family had the same bug as Olivia, and that doctors had been unable to figure out what it was, but they did eliminate COVID-19. It was not that. Then Brooke made her pitch to John. Instead of having her daughter Olivia fly to New Orleans, she suggested that Caroline come to stay with them in Washington, D.C. If Caroline came here, she and Olivia could spend time together and hole up in the house and do their required 2 weeks of quarantine before returning to school together. Now, Brooke knew that a lot of parents would immediately reject the idea of sending their child to a house where everybody is sick. But Caroline's father, John Schifflian, was no ordinary parent. He was an infectious disease specialist at Tulane University's medical school. He studied survivors of some of the world's worst infectious diseases, and probably had more information about COVID-19 than anyone else Brooke knew. And so if he was okay with Caroline coming to DC, Brooke was confident that it really was safe. After Brooke made her pitch, there was a few moments of awkward silence, and then John responded. It was widely understood that the longer somebody was sick, whether with COVID or something else, the less infectious the illness becomes to others. If Caroline visited, she likely wouldn't get sick at all, or she'd get a milder version of whatever Brooke's family had. Regardless, she wouldn't be in any significant danger. And also, John knew his daughter would totally go for this idea. She wanted to see her friend. And so ultimately, John agreed to the idea. Brooke thanked John and assured him that she'd do everything she could to make sure Caroline was safe. John thanked her, and then they hung up, and then Brooke practically ran into the house to tell her daughter the great news. A few days later, in early January of 2021, Brooke made her way to the front door of her house. Before she could reach for the handle, Olivia came bolting out of the kitchen and shooed her mom out of the way with more energy than Brooke had seen in weeks. Her daughter was practically jumping with excitement. Olivia threw open the door and immediately wrapped her arms around Caroline. As Brooke watched her daughter light up, she told herself this was the right decision. She turned to Caroline and told her she was welcome to take her mask off. She'd be here for the next 2 weeks anyway, and her dad was aware of the situation. Caroline and Olivia grinned at each other, then they took Caroline's bag and headed upstairs to Olivia's room. A few hours later, Brooke was sitting in the guest house catching up on her paperwork when her daughter Olivia came rushing inside. In a panicked voice, she explained that Caroline had a splitting headache and was currently in the bathroom throwing up. Brooke shot out of her chair, dizziness and anxiety bubbling up inside of her at the same time. Brooke couldn't believe what she'd done. She'd promised John that his daughter would be safe here. Now she was just as sick as the rest of them. Brooke followed Olivia out of the guest house and back to the main house, fighting off dizzying vertigo with every step. The next evening, on January 5th, 2021, Brooke stood outside the bedroom where Caroline was staying. She was trying to figure out if Caroline was asleep or not. Brooke gently knocked, and a few seconds later, Caroline opened up. Brooke realized that Caroline was actually on a video call on her phone, and she quickly apologized, saying she could come back later. But Caroline said, "Don't worry about it, she was on the phone with her dad." Seizing the opportunity, Brooke asked if she could speak to him for a second. Caroline handed over the phone, and Brooke told John she was absolutely mortified at the way his daughter's visit had gone so far. She repeated the apologies she'd been giving Caroline ever since she got sick. But John just waved her apology away. He said it was okay, he'd been the one who signed off on this trip, and he knew that the whole family was sick. And so Brooke felt her anxiety ease a little bit. At least John was not openly blaming her for what was going on with Caroline.
Through the storm and rain, walk through endless pain. Now the skies are clear, future feels so near. Left the dark behind, sun begins to shine. Heartaches turn to gold, stories yet untold. We are on our way to a brighter day. Future in our hands, on this golden land. Every step we take, no more hearts to break. us ahead. Past is fading fast. Peace will always last. We are on our way to a brighter day. Future in our hands on this golden land. Left the dark behind, sun begins to shine. Heartaches turn to gold, stories yet untold. We are on our way to a brighter day. Future in our hands on this golden land. Every step we take, no more hearts to break. Lighting up the night.
However, John wasn't quite finished with his response. He did want to call to Brooke's attention something that Caroline had brought up to him, something very important. Caroline had told him that her symptoms lessened whenever the girls went for a walk around the neighborhood. She also said that people seemed to get very sick very quickly when they came into the main house. That suggested to John that this was not an infectious disease. John thought it was much more likely that it was some kind of environmental illness, meaning there was something in the house doing it. And John actually had a sneaking suspicion about which environmental illness it was. So he recommended that Brooke go to the hardware store as soon as possible. There she could buy a device that would prove John's theory. Brooke was shocked at what she was hearing, but she promised John she would go to the store first thing tomorrow morning, and then she passed the phone back to Caroline, anxious but excited that they might actually finally figure out what was making everybody sick. The next morning, January 6th, 2021, Stefan returned home from the hardware store with this new device in hand. Brooke grabbed her husband by the arm and rushed him inside, eager to see if Caroline's father had been right. She grabbed the device from Stefan and then hit the on button. And right away, the machine began blaring. The kids ran downstairs, shouting over the alarm to ask what was going on. Brooke pointed to the device and told Stefan to explain it to them as she fumbled with her phone. She very quickly dialed 911 and ran out into the yard, explaining to the dispatcher what was going on through panicked breaths. She pleaded with them to hurry. Within minutes, Brooke heard sirens. She rushed to the door and hurried the firefighters inside, showing them the device that was still going off. The uniformed men yelled over the alarm and instructed everyone to go outside and wait while they dealt with whatever was going on inside the house. Brooke ushered Stefan and the kids out the door and across the street. Pretty soon, curious neighbors were standing in small clusters all along the sidewalk, their eyes wide as they took in all the emergency vehicles before them. As they watched the commotion unfold, Brooke turned to Caroline and asked her to call her father. She wanted to tell John he was right. The firefighters would discover that Brooke's family had a serious carbon monoxide leak in their home, and everyone, including Caroline, had carbon monoxide poisoning. Carbon monoxide, or CO for short, is an odorless, colorless gas that kills hundreds of people every year. When somebody has carbon monoxide poisoning, what happens is the carbon monoxide in the air replaces the oxygen in their bloodstream. As a result, the heart, brain, and body are starved of the oxygen they need to survive. The firefighters who responded to Brooke's call quickly figured out that the leak was coming from the basement furnace. A clamp had come loose and was spewing carbon monoxide throughout the 4-story house. That explained why Brooke felt better every time she worked in the guest house, and why Olivia and Caroline had fewer symptoms whenever they were out walking around in the neighborhood. Brooke was shocked that their smoke alarm already in the home didn't warn them about the poisonous gas exposure, but after inspecting the alarm, she realized it didn't have a CO detector at all. It had been installed a year before Washington, D.C. required them in all residences. In the end, Brooke's family and Caroline all recovered well from the CO poisoning. After the leak, Brooke bought 4 plug-in detectors that she installed on each level of the house, but every time she goes into the basement, she can't help but check to see that the furnace is still properly connected. From Ballen Studios and Wondery, this is Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, hosted by me, Mr. Ballen. A quick note about our stories: we use aliases sometimes because we don't know the names of the real people in the story. And also, in most cases, we can't know exactly what was said, but everything is based on a lot of research. And a reminder, the content in this episode is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment.
This episode was written by Natalie Pritzovsky. Our editor is Heather Dundas. Sound design is by Ryan Potesta. Our managing producer is Sophia Martins. And our